All right, we're at the last part of our lecture here where I want to talk about briefly the Adams and Jefferson presidencies. So there was an election in 1796. Washington announced that he would not be completing a third term, and so this was set as precedent until FDR. John Adams was the Federalist candidate. Let's jump ahead here. Thomas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. And at this point in time, the elections worked a little differently. So whoever got the most votes would be president. Whoever got the second most votes would be vice president. And this was in effect until 1804 with the 12th Amendment. So John Adams won the presidency. So Thomas Jefferson became vice president. And John Adams was a Federalist, but not conservative enough for a lot of people, including Alexander Hamilton, not a fan of John Adams. So the only thing really that I want to get into from the Adams presidency are the Alien and Sedition Acts, and these were enacted to prevent disloyalty in the United States. Okay, so it authorized the president to arrest and deport aliens suspected of treasonous leanings. And it was never used, but it threatened immigrants, many of whom supported Jefferson, and so this was a way for Federalists to make sure that they stayed in power. It also limited the number of immigrant voters by increasing the period of residence required for citizenship from 5 years to 14 years. So that, a lot of the Democratic Republicans were immigrants. That was the party that favored them the most, and so this kept them from voting for a longer time. The Sedition Acts imposed heavy fines and even imprisonment for anyone writing, speaking, or publishing anything of a false, scandalous, or malicious nature against the government or any officer of the government. And this was definitely controversial. People saw it as a symbol of tyranny. It went against freedom of speech, freedom of press. And because it passed, Federalists were convicted. They were imprisoned. Several Republican editors and even a lot of newspapers just completely shut down. So this was a problem. It wasn't repealed, but they both expired in 1800 and 1801. But this was certainly, a controversial situation that happened in the Adams presidency. And somewhat relevant today, right? We're getting, in some ways, people are talking about freedom of press issues. So just fun to remember that. So let's fast forward to the election of 1800. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied, and Adams came in third, so he was not a contender. And so in a tie situation, the House of Representatives decided, and they decided in 1801 in February that Thomas Jefferson was president, Aaron Burr was vice president. And so the Federalists did lose power. They lost, the executive branch because Thomas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. And before the Federalists left, they increased judicial power. So we have the Judiciary Act of 1801, which created 6 new circuit courts and 16 new judgeships. And they did this under the idea that the nation was expanding and they needed more of them. They also created several last-minute appointments to keep Federalist power in these judgeships. And one of them was William Marbury. He was appointed Justice of Peace for D.C. And when James Madison took over as secretary, Thomas Jefferson told him not to hand over those commissions. So they had already been appointed, but the paperwork had not officially gone through, and so they withheld it. And because he didn't get his commission, Marbury ended up suing. And so this is the case Marbury versus Madison of 1803. Which did rule in favor of Madison, saying that he was allowed to withhold those commissions. But the big outcome of this court case is that it affirmed the right of the Supreme Court to review statutes and interpret the meaning of the Constitution. So this is what gave the Supreme Court power to determine what is constitutional and what is not. And that's a big deal. So you will want to know about Marbury versus Madison. Another important thing that happened in 1803 is the Louisiana Purchase. And so we're going to talk briefly about this. In 1800, Spain had secretly given Louisiana back to France. And Thomas Jefferson was worried about Napoleon, who was, creating his empire over in Europe, continuing his empire over into the United States, and starting to take over. But Napoleon, was dealing with problems in Haiti, dealing with problems in Egypt. So when Thomas Jefferson sent James Monroe to go over there and try and buy, this area, the New Orleans and, part of France, Napoleon's agent, this guy Talleyrand, just offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory. But the Constitution didn't give any framework for purchasing new territory. So there was some debate about whether or not it was constitutional to do such a thing, but Thomas Jefferson just went ahead and declared it legal out of necessity, saying that he was saving the country. And so in April 1803, they officially purchased this Louisiana territory for $15 million. This is considered a major triumph for the United States. It basically doubled the size of the country for $15 million, but clearly a disaster for any native people who were living here. So that was not good. Just a couple other things that are going on at this time. The Lewis and Clark expedition. The wheels were in motion for that expedition to happen even before the purchase, but that made it much easier for them and actually added to what their mission would be. So between 1804 and 1806, they went from St. Louis to the Oregon coast, and their goal was to bring back plant and animal specimens, which they did do. They were looking for the easiest route to the coast and back, which they did not do. They never found an easy route. And they were also supposed to go along the way in this Louisiana Purchase area, telling everybody, this is part of the United States now, and trying to form alliances to some degree, which there were varying elements of success there. But they did get a very accurate map of their journey. They ended up paving the way for others, which again, good for the United States, bad for the native populations. So that as well was seen as a major success for the United States. So we're going to end our discussion there in the early 1800s, and we'll be back next week. So have a lovely week. See you next time.